Dear learner, my name is Dr. Mohammad Nazim, Associate Professor in the Department of Library and Information Science, Aligarh Muslim University. In the last lecture, we have just discussed the structure of the course, that is the course Information Processing and Retrieval, and we have already discussed the different related concepts of information processing and retrieval. In this lecture, we are going to start the concept of documentation, concept, purpose, and facets. So, by the end of this lecture, learners will be able to define the concept of documentation and explain its key characteristics. Learners will be able to describe the purpose and the need of documentation in information systems. They will be able to identify different facets of documentation and their roles, and they will analyze the relationship between documentation and information retrieval system. And finally, they will be able to evaluate the importance of documentation services in supporting users' information need. So just try to understand what is the meaning of documentation, what is the meaning of documents. So in the today's information rich environment, because we have in the environment where information is created very fast and the generation of knowledge is very rapid and continuous. So documentation plays an important role in the process of collecting, recording, organizing, and disseminating information. And it ensures that knowledge from all kinds of document is collected, organized, disseminated, and usable for the future reference. So documentation, we can say, is the foundation for information services supporting research, learning, and decision making. And we can say documentation transforms scattered information into organized and accessible knowledge. It means we try to acquire relevant information from the large collection of documents, and then we will be able to organize that information using different techniques, traditional techniques of library science like cataloging, classification, indexing, and then developing a mechanism for retrieving relevant knowledge from the organized knowledge. So documentation, as we can say, is one of the important activity in the field of library science, which try to collect relevant documents and then organize those documents in systematic manner and then provide relevant pinpointed information to the specialized users. So before discussing in detail about the concept and the definition of documentation, it is important for us to know what is the meaning of document. So the term document is derived from Latin word documentum and docio, and literally it refers to an example which mean to teach both for giving instructions and warning purposes. A document simply can be defined as a recorded source of information such as books, journals, reports, photographs, and digital files. And according to Ranganathan, a document is a graphic record of some idea or some phenomena made in words or in pictures. So a kind of graphic record which may be include textual information, which may include picture, but in the today's context, it may include a video and audio. So a document is a graphic record where different kinds of ideas in different formats may be put it. So document can be a multimedia document, document can be a textual document, and document may be a document related to the data. So we can distinguish documents in the context of the concept of the documentation. So there are two categories of document, macro document and micro document. So it is very important to distinguish and to understand the concept of macro and micro documents. So we can understand a micro document is a book, for example, a book of normal size, dealing with a large expanse of subject or volume of periodicals. So macro document means that is a document which cover a complete idea, a complete concept a complete subject. And one of the important example and relevant example is the book, which is complete in itself and covering a particular subject. And when we talk about the micro documents means it cover a specific aspect, a specific subject. A paper in the journal or a reprint or short extract from a book can be considered as a micro document, and they usually dealing with a specific or small extension but deep intention. So in the practical perspective, we can easily distinguish the macro document and micro document. A book is the example of macro document. On the other side, an article which is published in the journal is an example of micro document. So now come to the concept of documentation. Documentation can be defined as the process of collecting, organizing, storing and retrieving information. So this is the broader perspective of documentation, but there are certain authority who define the concept of documentation. J.S. Shera defined the concept of documentation as the group of techniques which are necessary for the ordered presentation, organization and communication of recorded specialized knowledge in order to give maximum accessibility and utility to the information contained. So you can see the definition clearly indicate that is the ordered presentation of information. A group of techniques are applied for the ordered presentation, organization and communication of recorded knowledge or recorded specialized knowledge. That is micro document, not ordinary kinds of document. And the reason is, and the purpose is to give maximum accessibility and utility to that information. So that is according to J.S. Shera. According to Ranganathan, documentation is the promotion and use of emerging micro thought of specialists with the emphasis on bibliographic control of micro documents. So this definition is very relevant because when the articles started publishing in the journals and the periodicals, it's become difficult to find a relevant article on a particular subject. And much literature is started publishing and it becomes very difficult for controlling the bibliographic control. So it was important to develop the services, the techniques like indexing services and the abstracting services to just identify what is being published in a particular subject area. So in this particular context, this definition is very relevant, that it is the promotion and use of emerging micro thoughts of specialists. Micro thoughts of specialists, that is the researchers, those working in a specific area of research. And the emphasis on bibliographic control, that is to control the publication. At least the researchers must know where the research is being published in their area of interest. And if we try to see the definition of ASLIP, that is recording, organization and dissemination of specialized knowledge, or in other words, documentation means that is collecting, organizing and providing micro thought to the scientists and the research scholars. So ultimately, if you try to analyze these three definitions, you will find the same concept, that is the micro thought. Micro thought means that is the research oriented information, that is the articles, a piece of article published in the journal and periodicals, a report which is published by a particular department and ministry. So these kinds of micro thoughts are important documents, and collection, organization and dissemination of these categories of documents is important, particularly for specialized users, not for the ordinary users, maybe for the scientists and maybe for the scholars. So if we talk about the scope of documentations, this definition of S.R. Ranganathan is very relevant. That is pinpointed, exhaustive and expeditious services of nascent micro thought to specialists. So this definition, a brief definition, clearly indicates the scope of documentation. That is nascent thought, that is the focus on newly generated knowledge rather than old thoughts. It means the research which is being published in journals that need to be available to the researchers who are conducting research in different areas of research. Then another important aspect is that is the micro documents, and the emphasis of documentation is on specific detailed documents rather than macro documents. So the concern was not on the books, the concern was on the periodicals and the articles which are published in periodicals in different subjects. They need to be scanned and a list need to be prepared according to the subject, according to the requirements of a specific researchers community. Then they may be handed over to the specialized users. And the third thing is that because the scope is very limited, the scope of documentation is limited to the specialist users. And this is the service which is especially designed for specialists rather than general users. So three important things need to be considered when we talk about the scope of documentation. That is the focus on newly generated information, particularly the research article published in the periodicals. Then the focus on micro documents instead of macro document, and the user community is specialized, not the general user community. So documentation means providing relevant, that is pinpointed, exactly which is required by the researchers, information which is exactly required by the researchers. That should be exhaustive, that is complete, because the complete information is important for the researchers, particularly for the purpose of review of literature and to identify the gap of research on the basis of the review of literature. So it should be exhaustive and it should be expeditious. It means it should be very fast. So that as soon as the new information, new findings, new research is published, it must be available immediately to the researchers. So these are the important things that need to be considered when we started developing the documentation services in the libraries and information centers. Now come to the need of documentation. So need of documentation is started because of the information challenges. So what kinds of information challenges are there? That is exponential growth of information. And we can see how information is rapidly growing. And if we try to see the number of records which are included in Web of Science, in Scopus, and in other kinds of databases like PubMed Central, so number of documents are growing very fast. And the information is generated very fast. So it is very difficult to identify the relevant information from the huge amount of information. Not only this, the information is being published in multiple formats, in printed documents, in online documents, in the form of online databases, in the form of journals. So it is also difficult for a user to find relevant information from the multiple formats of documents. And the role of traditional libraries was limited, that just try to acquire the periodicals, acquire the journals, and try to do the technical processing like classification and cataloging, and try to provide the traditional services like circulation and reference services. So these services, traditional services of the libraries, are not relevant for the specialized kinds of researchers. The next thing is that changing environment, because changing information needs. Users are not relied only on books, but they need other kinds of material. That is, they need the periodicals, they need specialized information, and they need ready-made information. And emergence of new disciplines. Earlier, there were a few disciplines like humanities and science, but now new disciplines have been emerged, and relevant and very much research is being conducted in the field of social sciences, engineering and technology, and therefore specialized documentation centers are required, or even they have been developed in different areas, in social sciences, in technology, and even in defense area. And the last thing is that in this changing environment is the changing nature of sources of information, particularly the rise of journal articles and research papers. And you can see how many journals are now being published. More than 20,000 journals are indexed in Scopus, and around 12,000 journals are indexed in Web of Science. So these are the quality journals which are indexed or included in these reputed databases. But there are many more journals which are being published in all over the world. So just finding a relevant article from the large amount of journals are very difficult. That is why the changing nature of sources of information is there, and for that, to control this thing, it is important to have a documentation services, and documentation centers need to be developed. Now, need for solution for these two kinds of problem, because there is a challenge of exponential growth of information. There is a challenge of different categories of information sources and different kinds of information needs of the users. So solution is that we need to quickly identify the required information, and it is also important we need to organize information systematically, and efficient dissemination of information is also important. So keeping these things in mind, during 1950s or before 1950s, documentation centers started being developed in all over the world. And the purpose of documentation center was to systematically organize information from large amount of sources of information. They also provide easy access and retrieval to information. And ultimately, the ultimate purpose of these documentation center is to support for research and learning. So these are the objectives of documentation. That is the information control. It is also called bibliographic control. Managing the huge amount of information and rapid increase in published literature through the organized documentation services. So information control means that is bibliographic control is possible if we start developing documentation activities and documentation services. Documentation provide the efficient retrieval of information and enabling user to find specific and specialized information through cataloging, indexing, and abstracting services. The dissemination of knowledge is faster because actively distributing information through current awareness services. So current awareness services, the meaning of current awareness services is that as soon as the information is arrived, it need to be intimated to the users. However, the selective dissemination of information services, which is meant for specialized users, and for that a complete process is required, that we need to create the user profile, we need to create the document profile, and then we need to do the matching after a frequent interval, and then we need to intimate to the users the results which are relevant. And at the end, the feedback is also important to know whether the information which is supplied to the user is relevant or not relevant. Then ultimate purpose of the documentation is the support for research, and we can assist the researchers, we can assist the scientists and the academicians by providing bibliographies, a list of books on a specific subject, a list of articles on a specific subject can be compiled and can be provided to the scientists and academicians and researchers. We can also help researchers in conducting literature searches, and even if a library or information system centers does not have a document which is required by the user, that document can be provided through document delivery services. The next important objective of the documentation is the organization of resources. And documentation activities are known for the organization of resources by processing document via classification and cataloging and making them accessible, covering both physical as well as digital documents. It means we need to compile all kinds of documents, maybe they are digital as well as they are physical format. And the last important objective of the documentation is the preservation and access to knowledge, particularly specialized or historical materials, while ensuring it is available for future use. So there are different activities which come under the purview of the documentation. According to Ranganathan, there are 5 important activities which come under the purview of the documentation. These are indexing, abstracting, reprography, translation, and the preparation of bibliographical list. These activities can be grouped into 2 important facets, and they are known as facets of the documentation: documentation work and documentation service. And the same concept is basically given by Guha in different way. That is, identified 2 facets of documentation, that is active documentation and passive documentation. Active documentation is basically related to the documentation work, and passive documentation is related to the documentation services. And this is not a new concept basically. If we try to see the services of the libraries, there are 2 categories of library services: technical services and public services. Technical services include acquisition, classification, cataloging, periodical processing, whereas public services of the libraries include circulation, reference service, current awareness service, and selective dissemination of information service. In the same way, documentation work include the activities like indexing, like abstracting, like reprography, whereas documentation services include different kinds of services like current awareness service, SDI, document delivery service, and many more. So, documentation work can be defined as the systematic process of collecting, organizing, processing, storing, and disseminating recorded knowledge to meet the user's information needs. And these activities are carried out in documentation center, because sometimes a specialized documentation center can be established, and they may also be initiated in the libraries and information center, where the trained professionals can manage scientific, technical, and scholarly information. So there are 2 facets as we have discussed: documentation work and documentation service. Documentation work involves systematic collection, organization, processing, and indexing, abstracting, and storage of recorded information. Whereas documentation service refers to delivering processed information to users through different services like current awareness service, selective dissemination of information, translation, reprography, and document delivery services. The focus of documentation work is on preparing information resources, that is the preparation of the list of different sources in a structured form to enable efficient retrieval and use of information. Whereas the focus of information services or documentation services on providing timely, relevant, and user-oriented information to support research and decision making. So we can make a difference between documentation work and documentation service, and we can say documentation work is, or documentation list is prepared on the anticipation of user's demand, whereas documentation service is precise request of the users, and they may be provided on the basis of the user's demand. In the documentation work, we try to compile current awareness list or documentation list, whereas in documentation service we try to provide different kinds of documentation services, including current awareness service, selective dissemination of information. In the documentation work, we try to create or prepare document profiles and user profiles for the selective dissemination of information system. We try to prepare indexing or indexing list. We try to prepare abstracting services, and we prepare information consolidation and products, create bibliography, union catalog, and we try to compile translation index and prepare the index of the translation. On the other side, documentation service include a service part where we provide indexing services through the indexing periodicals to the user, We try to serve the abstracting services through abstracting periodicals, and we try to serve information consolidation and products to the users, and also provide bibliographic services by compiling and handling or offering the bibliographic services or bibliographies. A reading list can also be prepared and compiled and maybe hand over to the users. So now come to the concept of the documentation list, which may be defined as the list of pertinent material on a specific subject or the topic bearing on the requirement or request of researchers, scientists or technologists for available information, retrospective or current or both. So this is a very comprehensive definition which is given by T.D. Wilson, which include the list. That is, we need to prepare a list as a specialist, we need to prepare a list, and that list may be prepared on the subject, a specific subject, even on the specific topic, and that may be created on the basis of the request of the researcher, scientist or technologist. And this list is not basically prepared for the general users. This may be prepared for the specialist users like researchers, scientists and technologists. And when we compile a list, then we need to collect different kinds of sources, maybe the retrospective sources as well as the current or both. So a comprehensive list can be prepared on the basis of the collection of both traditional or retrospective sources of information and the sources which are recently published. So what are the important features of the documentation list? The features, the documentation list, the focus of the documentation list on micro documents, and we have already defined what is the meaning of the micro documents, and this is meant for specialist users, not for the ordinary or general users. And the grouping of entries by subject with alphabetical arrangement, because the list is prepared on a subject, on a topic, so that is why it is important that the entries can be grouped by subject in alphabetical arrangement so that the specific entry can easily be identified by the users. And the ultimate purpose of the documentation list is to keep users informed about the current literature, what is being published in his or her area of interest, and that ultimately save the time of the user. And by converging scattered information, we can prepare a list and hand over to the users. It ultimately fulfill the information requirements related to the current literature and can save the times of the users. So there are three important factors when we try to compile a documentation list. So these are the three factors are important, that is converge. That is, converge means bringing the scattered information from various sources into one accessible location. So acquisition of sources, acquisition of relevant sources, collecting relevant sources and compiling information which is relevant to the user is very important. The approach should be easy, that we need to organize information in systematic and user-friendly manner so that a user can easily find or retrieve the needed information. And speed is one of the important factors. That is, saving the time of the user is one of the important aspects of the service delivery. So enabling rapid access to relevant documents and saving researchers' precious time is important. So whenever we try to compile a documentation list, these three factors must be kept in mind. So there may be different kinds of documentation list, and Ranganathan identified different kinds of documentation list, that is structural varieties of list based on the nature of the entries. So the list may be a bare documentation list that include minimum information. Minimum information means the author of the document, the title of the document, and exact place of occurrence. So only three things can be given in the bare documentation list, that is the name of author, title, and the location of the document. And we can also prepare a documentation list which is known as indexing periodical, and this bare list of articles appearing in current issues of the periodicals. There may be another category which is known as annotated list, which include brief indication of scope, standard and authoritative nature. And abstracting periodical is the list with abstract of the article from current periodical issues. And documentation list with abstract means that we need to provide the bibliographic detail of the document such as author, title and location, along with the brief statement of essential contribution to knowledge in the form of abstract. And finally, another category of documentation list is the bibliographic periodical, where the different periodicals published in a specific subjects are scanned, and then the bibliographic detail of the articles as well as their abstracts are included in the bibliographic periodicals. So what is the workflow of documentation? That is, what is the process of documentation? How a documentation work can be carried out in a documentation center or in the library. So there are different sequence of activities that ensure efficient information management and retrieval. So first of all, it is important for the libraries and for the documentation center to acquire documents, and this is called information acquisition, where documents are collected from publishers, from databases, from research institutions, and in the modern environment they may be collected from the websites also, on online databases. Then we need to do the screening and selection, because everything is not relevant. Whatever we have collected need to be screened and selected. A selection is required, and we need to do the review, and review according to the relevance, authenticity and value to the users. On the basis of these parameters are relevance, authenticity and value to the users, the document which are acquired need to be screened and select. And then finally we need to do the processing and organization, where we need to do the different kinds of technical processing to those selected documents. And these are the classification, cataloging, indexing and abstracting. And this is important because the identification and location of relevant document is important. So that is why these activities are important for the documentation processing. And finally, we need to store the documents and the information in the databases. For that, we need to, in case of physical documents, we can easily file them into the shelf in the library or documentation center. But today's environment, we need to create a database, and information which is stored in documentation systems and digital repositories, in databases, or even in the server. And the next step is the information retrieval, where we need to provide a search interface to the users, where a user can interact with the document, with the information. And user can search through search terms, catalog, indexes, and different kinds of search systems. And the search strategies can be applied for finding relevant information. And the last step in the whole documentation process is the dissemination and user services, and which is the ultimate objective of the documentation process. And delivery of information is very important for the users. So delivery through reference services, through current awareness services, through alerts, through digital platforms, or even through selective dissemination of information services. Now come to the historical background of this documentation system and development of documentation. So the term documentation, if we try to see, for the first time used by Paul Otlet, who was the co-founder of the International Institute of Bibliography. And in the year 1905, he used it to describe activities such as collecting, processing, storing, retrieving and disseminating documents. And later in the year 1934, Paul Otlet published another volume, Trade De-Documentation, which is one of the earliest work in this particular area. And in the year 1937, the institute was renamed the International Federation for Documentation, and different kinds of activities, documentation activities at the international levels are performed by this particular International Federation for Documentation. Further development occurred when Samuel C. Bradford published a very important volume in the year 1948. And after the World War II, UNESCO started promoting documentation activities in all over the world through the division of documentation, libraries and archive. And we can see that with the support of UNESCO, different documentation center at the national level and international level has been developed. And in our country, Indian National Scientific Documentation Center was also developed with the support of UNESCO. And the same kinds of documentation centers were also established in other countries like in Egypt and in Pakistan or even in Bangladesh recently. So this is the international level efforts of at the international level, and by the support of UNESCO, different documentation centers were established in all over the world. If we talk about the documentation activities in India, so early beginning started in the Forest Research Institute, Dehradun. And this is the first institute which took initiative at the larger level scale, where the different kinds of documentation activities were performed. Particularly, they have designed a special scheme of classification for the classification of documents related to the forestry. Another initiative in the year 1935 in India is the efforts which is done by National Institute of Science. And they produced first abstracting journal in India. And we know what is the meaning of abstracting journal. Just scanning the different periodical in a specific subject and then compiling the detail of each article along with the abstract. And this was the first initiative in India, and the name of that journal, abstracting journal, was Indian Science Abstract. And the publication was continued until 1940. Another initiative in India, early initiative in India, is the initiative taken by Central Board of Irrigation in the year 1936. And they started publishing a quarterly bulletin, and the name of the bulletin was Irrigation Abstract. That means the abstract of the journals in the field of irrigations are compiled and distributed through this particular publication. And after the World War II, industrial bibliography is also compiled by the Council of Scientific and Industrial Research, and many more such kinds of products were produced by the Council of Scientific and Industrial Research in India. And later we know there are three important documentation centers were developed. One is INSTOC, other is DECIDOC in the field of defense science, and other in the field of social science, which is known as NASDOC. So now come to the summary. We can revisit what is the meaning of documentation. Documentation is a systematic process of collecting, organizing, processing and disseminating recorded knowledge. And the aim is to meet the information need of specialists and the researchers. That we have already discussed. The documentation services are meant for specialized users, not for the general categories of the users. The emphasis of the documentation services was on timely access to micro level information. And the key techniques which are involved in the process of documentation work include indexing, abstracting, and preparation of documentation list. And the concept of documentation was evolved from the traditional library practices to structured and specialized library services such as current awareness service and selective dissemination of information. There are many efforts at the national and international level. With the support of UNESCO, different documentation centers have been developed all over the world. And it ensure efficient organization of information and facilitate quick and accurate information retrieval, particularly for the development of research and conducting the research in a specific area. And the documentation support active communication and dissemination of knowledge in the information rich environment. So this is the list of important books that can be consulted for more detail on this particular topic. And really I am very much thankful to you. Thank you very much.